I'm Paul Musto from Siemens Digital Industries Software, and I welcome you to our next episode in our podcast series, Startups, Digitalization and Realization, where we meet leaders from the newest and most innovative companies in the world to learn how they turn great ideas into successful companies. Today, we are joined by Alexey Matyushev, co-founder and CEO of Nautilus Corporation, a California-based startup working on rethinking the next generation of freight aircraft. They believe that reducing the cost of air freight by 50% will bring fresher produce into stores, enable cross-border e-commerce to flourish, and enable low infrastructure regions to further develop. They are a small and growing team of passionate engineers who have worked on over 25 aircraft programs in general aviation, commercial, and military aviation. Alexey has over 10 years experience with aircraft performance and has played a lead aerodynamics role in 5 aircraft design programs. He has a deep knowledge of low-cost manufacturing, airframe design, stress analysis, and systems design. Alexey has also prior experience with high-tech entrepreneur startup ventures in aerospace and mobile business sectors. Thank you for joining us today, Alexey. Before we dive right in, can you give us a little bit more information about yourself, Nautilus, and your mission?
Absolutely. So a little bit more background about myself is I'm trained as an aerodynamicist, graduated with a bachelor's degree in aerospace engineering, but I always felt a passion for the way things fly. So out of the only specializations that the school had to offer, I chose probably the one that's least likely to land me a job, which is aerodynamics. Coming out of college, I just happened to be at the right place and the right time. And Piper Aircraft at that time hired me on as an aerodynamics engineer, and I started my career in aerospace. And then going fast forwarding about 4 to 5 years, I became a consultant quite a bit through the aerodynamics work that I've done. We had an industrial design firm that we were really doing quite well with, and we were making $1,000 an hour. Can you imagine that? Sitting in as an engineer, and
No,
you're
I can't
making
imagine
20,
that.
yeah, $35, $40 an hour, and every single time you get a notification that you're making $1,000 an hour. So I think for us, it was a wake-up call that there might be something better in the world of business. So we actually left the aerospace world and started an industrial design firm that was completely focused on these small little products that you would buy at Best Buy at the very last aisle. Cables, for us, as an example, chargers would be another example. Got into wine glasses, something like that. Those were making us hand over fist way more money than we would have made in actually sitting at a desk and doing aerospace engineering.
That's crazy. So, a burning question on my mind is, so when you think of a typical drone aircraft, most of us think of smaller craft, maybe consumer type drones and quadcopters and things like that. And of course, we've heard a lot over the years, recent years, about military drones that are larger and can fly longer distances and do all kinds of fancy stuff. But you'd never think as a startup company tackling something like that is possible, right? It's an absolute daunting challenge. Can you share with our audience how you came up with the idea for Nautilus and the product concept and kind of how you got things going?
Yeah, absolutely. So, actually, being part of those military projects, we kind of saw firsthand what it actually takes to build them. And I think one of the most disappointing facts of those types of technologies is they were 30 years behind. I guess the way that I actually illustrate it is if you imagine in 2010, if you own a PlayStation 2 or 3, you're playing a video game, Call of Duty, or maybe or so, is you see really cutting edge graphics. But if you go back into the military world and you do a battle simulator, it's like in Donkey World. So it's like we're seeing N64 graphics being planted as being the cutting edge of military. So I think, we always saw the evolution. There was an opportunity to evolve the products, both from the military side. And when we saw the commercial side as well, we always knew that they're going to get bigger. The payloads are going to be, more demanding. They're going to be larger. It's going to move into cargo. We're going to want, these different types of sensors and whatnot. So we always saw the evolution of the commercial DJI drone to be something way, way larger into what it is. And so that's kind of where we leaned into our background. We spent, 3 years with customers, and we came to the conclusion that the first product needs to be this 19,000-pound airplane.
So, have you been able to draw a lot of ideas and concepts from the applications in the military?
The military applications are a good byproduct of what not to do.
Ah,
So,
and why is that?
yeah, it's a great question. But, I think one of the biggest heartbreaks in United States military history is the F-22. And, you look at those types of airplanes, and we were supposed to order thousands of them. It's supposed to be a cutting edge military drone. And budgets get cut, and they order, 100 of them, right? And so the price per aircraft is just so astronomical, and the price of hardware is just so difficult to actually be meaningful, that I think that's what really gives the experience of airplanes are expensive to investors, and we should not invest into any more of that. If you look at the business aviation world, you look at Gulfstream, though, you can certify an airplane in 12 months. So I think the military has always been very eager to learn from the commercial general aviation world or business world is how do you make an airplane in 2 years and certify it and make it flyable and sell thousands of units. It's not the F-22 story.
So do you see Nautilus, the aircraft that you developed, do you see that companies buying that and offering it as a service, or do you see the current freight and delivery companies, UPS, and maybe Amazon, FedEx, do you see them purchasing these aircraft, or do you see it more as kind of a service that you provide to companies like that?
I can't talk a lot about my customers, our customers,
Okay.
but yeah, but it's kind of the likely candidate list, I would say. But we're not a service provider. We design, we manufacture, and we sell the airplanes. And I think there's a lot of conversation both in Silicon Valley and startups such as ours if it does become a service. And I think Silicon Valley does want it to become a service, but I think it is a very difficult thing where you go through all of that and then you still have to apply for a different certificate within the FAA. So it's kind of the idea is, why doesn't Boeing become an airline?
Yeah, exactly. So do you ever see this evolving into human transportation?
It's a great question. I get asked that all the time. And the technology is there. In the 1970s, Lockheed TriStar was able to do autonomous takeoff, climb, cruise, descent, and land, right? So that was the first fully autonomous airplane. We had that in the 1970s, 1980s, something like that. But it's just the human intuition. You and I have not gotten into an autonomous car, right?
Yeah,
But
no.
imagine an airplane, and I think it's not about technology. I think it's about the ability to trust technology. And so Nautilus, although it has the ambitions to do something like that in the very far future, we're not thinking about that right now.
I think as a potential consumer of it, even with automobiles or any autonomous technology, it's the comfort of knowing that there's autonomous systems that kind of back up the human aspect of it that you feel safer with, right? So I don't know that I don't know that I'm ready to just jump in an autonomous car and let the vehicle take me wherever it wants to take me. So yeah, so it's really interesting. I do know that there are other companies looking at autonomous aircraft, but I'm not sure of exactly where that technology stands. So are there other companies that are trying to do the same type of technology?
There are, but we see ourselves as kind of being the largest. I think that's really important to note. We always saw in the military sector where we used to work, especially in aerospace, is that things keep getting larger and larger and larger until you actually reach capacity, right? When the drone craze of, maybe I call it the 2013 craze, the drone craze of 2013 started to happen with this consumer drones. We knew that they were going to become hybrid, they were going to become larger, and there's going to be larger and larger loads that the customers are going to be demanding to carry. So we decided that as aerospace engineers, you never vowed to start an airplane company because that's a way to lose $1 billion, right? It was an idea that, what if you just started at the end? Like, why don't you pursue where it's going to end up with? And so we figured out really quickly in sneaking into conferences and whatnot that the first product needs to look like a 3.8 or a 4-ton freighter. And so it's a very large airplane. And so we believe that these, drone consumer companies are essentially iterating to go into where our initial start is.
So are these vehicles air carriers? Are they full electric vehicles, or are they hybrid vehicles?
Yeah, so it's a great question. Look. So when we were working for industry 10 years ago, we were looking at hybrid and electric before it became a buzzword in Silicon Valley. And we really quickly figured out that it's very difficult to introduce electricity into an airplane and actually make it worthwhile. The challenge behind that is, we think about electric cars and say, like, well, gosh, why don't we introduce the same technology into airplanes? But what you don't really realize is, like, a Tesla weighs twice as much as an average car. So when you actually go back into the airplane world and you try to introduce the same technology, it's a lot of weight. And so what we're really looking for in the aerospace world is twice, I guess it's like energy battery density. We need a 2x increase in energy battery density to make it actually the same as viable for fuel. And I think that's where we'll get electrification really going in the industry. Beyond that, though, I know there's a lot of startups that are actually working on electrification, and but those flights are, an hour, not even that, maybe 45 minutes. You know what I mean? And it's enough for a flight for a student to go practice landings, but it's not enough for a practical flight for moving cargo or passengers.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. That's what I was thinking. I mean, the weight of batteries and so forth has got to be a huge challenge to overcome. So, what was the process that you went through to validate the effectiveness of the design that you guys were coming up with?
So going back to that, it's the idea that no aerospace engineer with an aerospace background wants to start an airplane company. You see how much money is actually flushed down the toilet, right? When we actually had this successful design firm, we were making thousands of dollars a day, right? Getting paid way more than we would have if we worked at as aerospace engineers. The thought process was if we're going to start an airplane company, well, we have to make sure that the customers are aligned with exactly what we want. We were not designing business jets for rich people. So I think one of the first things that the company did, which was exactly correct, was we actually snuck into a bunch of freight forwarding. They would call them conferences. So we snuck in and we actually posed as students. So we actually used our school IDs and snuck into these conferences and tried to sell them the airplane. And we actually were able to achieve about $200 million in letters of intent from those conferences.
Wow. That's pretty creative and pretty impressive. So I was reading one of the recent articles about Nautilus, and it mentioned that you had a pretty aggressive plan to actually have a plane up and flying by 2020. Were you able to achieve that, and kind of where does that stand at this point?
Absolutely. So we actually have a prototype that's finished its basis, as I would call it. It's non-public for a variety of reasons, but I don't want to dive into that. But anyway, so we actually finished the prototype and it's been completed. And we did that under $1 million. And it was a 30-foot prototype, 2,200 pounds, which rivals probably some of the most cutting edge technology that the United States military has had over the last 30 years. So I think with a team of 4 and built out a garage, I think it's a very impressive feat. But we're really gunning our sights into this first production vehicle. And the production vehicle is going to fly in 2 years.
That is an incredibly impressive feat. Again, I can't even imagine the complexity. I mean, this is not a small system, one-dimensional system for that matter. There's a lot to it. So I was also reading in that article that one of the ways you do energy savings is to fly at lower altitude. Can you give us a little bit of insight on that? I know that in general, I was also reading that your goal was to reduce the cost of air freight by 50%, and I'm sure that plays into that.
We have achieved the cost savings of 50%. We originally started the company with a thinking that you can take a Mach 0.85 jet and actually reduce the speed of it and drag as a square velocity, so you can actually play into that. But unfortunately, when we started marketing that to customers, the obvious ones, of course, we figured out really quickly that their networks, and it's all about the network and transition, doesn't really play into that. So it was a new market and a new product for them, if that makes sense. An example would be like FedEx overnight, right? So you pay $100 to send an envelope overnight to anywhere in the United States. But for them, introducing an airplane that cruises maybe at 2 to 3 days, it just didn't really play into their network. And they saw an incredible risk to their business as far as taking on that kind of product. So what we actually ended up doing was speeding up the airplane back into exactly the same speed regimes as everybody else. So like UPS or FedEx might fly MD-11s or MD-80s. So we sped up the airplane to exactly the same network regimes, but we figured out a different way to reduce the cost, and it was all about e-commerce.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the biggest insights that the business has is that the idea that when you open an Amazon package, it's halfway full of air, right?
Yeah.
If you look at the densities and the way that these airplanes are being operated, whether I'm just say like FedEx or UPS, Lufthansa, DHL, or something else in the Asia, is that they're actually topping out on volume instead of weight. So the thinking behind the company was, well, if you make the airplane speed up exactly to where it needs to be, Mach 0.85 along with the same traffic, but introduce 50% more volume, you can actually carry 50% more revenue cargo.
Ah, I see. So it's getting rid of that excess dead air, if you want to call it that, out of the packaging itself.
It's introducing 50% more volume to allow for it in the airplane.
Shifting gears a little bit, talking about yourself and getting a company off the ground. That's kind of what this channel is also about, giving some insight to other entrepreneurs and innovators out there as to what it takes to start a company. I mean, I've mentioned a couple of times already, this is an incredible, daunting challenge that you and your company took on. So what insight would you have for others out there on, how do you launch a company like this? And maybe if you can share a little bit about how you funded it, how you went about that aspect of it as well.
I think like one of the biggest insights that I tell entrepreneurs that are just starting out is that don't read the news. I think it's really it's really easy for all of us to see the news. This company got funded with 20 million. This company got funded with 50 million. And it makes us feel like superheroes. Well, gosh, I just have to move to San Francisco and we start this company and I'll magically be funded $20 million. That's not the case.
Absolutely. So how did you do any crowdsource funding or anything along those lines, or?
As an industrial design firm, we did this and we were making, hand over fist for money. But it's just, I think it's really important to know that these are big projects. You know what I mean? I think Silicon Valley right now is very focused on making returns really quick. As I've been told many times that, I go pitch a VC, before the pandemic, and I'm sitting in the partner room, and then there's always three entrepreneurs that actually have revenue, they actually have scale, sitting right behind me. And so why should Silicon Valley invest in this? Because for them, they have LPs, limited partners, that they have to provide returns to. So the answer to the question, I think, is like, we asked for flying cars and we got 13 characters. And I think, for big projects such as this, it's a wake-up call. I think it's very difficult to get them funded, and I don't think it's something that you should really go in there and move to San Francisco and just start out of willy-nilly. I think you have to have a lot of thought behind it, and I think that's what really came into.
Yeah, I've talked to a lot of startups, a lot of entrepreneurs, and they've mentioned the same scenario that you mentioned. And, they become beholden to the venture capitalists as well, right? Or if they're part of an incubator or an accelerator, they're kind of beholden to that organization to continue to drive for revenues and profits and so forth, right? So there's also an obligation there as well. That might take away from the mission a little bit. I don't know if you feel the same way. So what made you jump from a lucrative design firm to starting up your own company?
It's a really hard question, and me and my wife are still debating it to this day, 4 years later. But I think something like this should really, exist. That's really the fundamental thing. And I know investors, especially during the first kind of conference call or interview, they always want to make sure that there's grit within the entrepreneur, and there's belief that this is actually going to need to be available, or it's going to really eventually somebody's going to do it, right? I think that's what it was. Entrepreneurs, most people think that, you raise $5 million, you pay yourself $500,000 a year, and then everything is golden. But entrepreneur salaries are, we're sitting at below $75,000 a year, and I think it's for a CEO, right? And so it's really the belief and the grit that actually you want to see something like this succeed, and all your motivation is actually tied in equity. And I just want to make sure that people listening to this podcast just really understand that you really want to believe in what you really put forward in front of the investors.
That's fantastic. You mean not everybody gets bought out for, some multi-billion-dollar acquisition? It's hard.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really hard. I would love to see that everywhere, but it's not the way it works.
Yeah, that's great. So besides some of the obvious things, what were some of the biggest challenges that you faced coming, from a business perspective, even a product development perspective, right? You're low on resources. So, how do you even begin to get a product designed and actually manufactured, right?
When it comes to airplanes, I think investors think big money, right? And I think in the aerospace industry as a whole, we've done a really bad job of proving that venture capital can go and produce a product. A good example of that might be Eclipse Aviation. So there was a Paul Allen, I wouldn't say a Paul Allen project, but it was somebody that spun off from Microsoft, had lots of capital, and they started a business jet company, right? And they burned $1 billion, before they were able to certify, if not that. And so the remains were bought out by a conglomerate, yada, yada, yada. But I think it's a good example that I think in the industry that you need to know what you're doing. And you had to have walked around the block a couple times to actually build something like this. I know, and everybody's going to say Alex say Elon Musk, well, he didn't know anything about rockets, but he designed a rocket from scratch. Yeah. but it took $100 million to get started. So in a world where seed rounds and Series A rounds are built around, 2 to 3 million and, $10 million Series A, I think it's something you have to know what you're doing and you have to make sure that you're after the right milestones.
Yeah, that's fantastic advice. So, what are some of the big key challenges moving forward, do you see?
We actually had this one big challenge this morning. It's we're talking with suppliers and we're trying to buy actuators. And because we're not a mainstream company, we're not a Gulfstream, we're not a Boeing or Airbus or a Cessna or anybody else. It's just nobody wants to really talk with us, right? And it's really frustrating because you want to spend money on it, right? You want to give them money, but it's just the way that the organization was built is here's Alexei coming out of left field and he's wanting to buy $3 million worth of hardware, but we've never heard of Alexei or his company. So why should we talk to him? So I think it's really frustrating to me is, General Electric, which produces some of the world's best engines, or Rolls-Royce, don't have a buy button on their website. So you have to know a guy who knows a guy, who contact a guy that actually can be able to sell you engines. And I think it's one of the biggest things that's really frustrating within the industry.
Yeah. And actually, I've heard that from other startup companies too. And that not even, even with products of much smaller scale, right? Even getting, for electron, my background is in electronics, and even in the electronics field, if you're looking at getting any attention from a Texas Instruments or a Broadcom or somebody to designing these, leading edge devices, it's really tough. It's really difficult, right? They send you off to third parties and so forth, right? So again, I think that probably is another good piece of insight for startup companies, that it's a little bit more difficult to get access to those kinds of resources, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's something that we see a huge stagnation in the aerospace sector. And I think that's one of the reasons. If you want to buy something, or you're an entrepreneur, or you're starting a company and you want to buy electrical motors that are aerospace grade, or you want to buy actuators, you have to be part of the network, the who's who, to even get access to that type of hardware. And so that's when we see innovation happen, is because entrepreneurs feel frustrated that they don't get access to the hardware, that they actually start evolving the hardware from their own garage.
Right. Yeah, that's great. Just because it's topical, I'll ask you the question, in terms of the pandemic, has that had any impact on your company? And, have you done have you needed to do anything to respond to it?
I mean, for us, we're in the cargo business. So I think it brought a huge highlight to the cargo sector, which I think is really important. I think a lot of innovation in aerospace has been focused on sending people to Mars, hypersonics, this and that, supersonics. But cargo is such an important sector that I think, people really put it aside. And so I'm really excited that the pandemic, although it was, of course, is really demoralizing for all of us, is just it put a highlight onto that sector. We've seen a huge amount of layoffs from really big companies. We've seen a huge influx in talent approaching us. And so we've actually been thriving in the pandemic.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting point, right? I mean, the whole e-commerce sector has kind of exploded, right? So the demand and need for something like this probably has increased dramatically. Actually, in general, I've talked to other startup companies, and they've kind of been able to work right through it, which has been fantastic. Obviously, some of the funding might have, been delayed or postponed, but in general, a lot of the startup companies have been able to kind of work their way through it because they haven't been so dependent on, some of the other economic situations that have been out there. So, but that's fantastic that you were able to take it and use it as an opportunity, right? Okay, so shifting gears again around the choice of Siemens software. I don't want to make it into an advertisement at all, but I think the point that or one of the things that we're seeing out in the industry is the need for higher end products and tools, even at the startup level, to help get these systems designed and into manufacturing. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so the company started out, and our pedigree again is going back from aerospace world. So two of the three co-founders were really influenced by Unigraphics when we were in industry, right? We kind of saw what the tool is, and shortfalls and positives again with that tool. But we saw the CATIA tool as well, and SolidWorks again. But when it was time to really launch the startup, we really sunk our teeth into SolidWorks, and it was because of the pricing. And to be honest, we've regretted it ever since, because a lot of the things that we've been doing in SolidWorks, which has got us through the first prototype, have really not been. They could not actually get to the evolution that we needed them for suppliers to actually manufacture the first prototype, the production prototype. And so, yeah, it was actually, I'm super happy that, we moved into Unigraphics and then, NX and see what that actually really, it was just, and it's this incredible tool for us. And it's just, we really feel bad because we spent so much time in SolidWorks. And so we had to remodel quite a bit of the things from SolidWorks into NX. And so I guess, and the pricing was the barrier, right? And just learning what we actually was available in NX, I think was really monumental to us.
That's fantastic to hear. Although, it's unfortunate that we see a lot of companies go through that same transition. It's painful, right? Because you have to kind of do a bit of a reset, right?
It was a reset, yeah.
What about on simulation? What kinds of simulations is Nautilus doing?
We're doing quite a bit of FEM work, of course, as well as CFD work. For CFD, we rely quite heavily on NASA codes. So we do take the NX models, we export them out and run them through NASA tools. And that seems to be easy because, again, like the industry codes seem to be very, very expensive. And if you have access to it, the US based tools, I think, are very, very robust. And if you know how to use them, I think it's just great. But for the FEM side, we definitely use the Nastran tool set, and something that we want to dive into a little bit further in the future, but with Siemens. But for us, where we stand is, it's everything is great. We just use it strictly for CAD.
Yeah, that's fantastic. What about data management? Have you guys started implementing any data management environments?
We are starting. So actually, we're working alongside with Siemens to figure out how we can move quite a bit of the work that we're doing into the cloud. I think this pandemic is very, unfortunately, it's difficult, but trying to bring new employees on board is everybody's kind of looking to work through this remote basis for at least the next 6 months. And I think it's trying to figure out from our perspective how to move these tools, which are so necessary to the way we work, into the cloud. And so I think working with Siemens has been really great so far, but we haven't reached the end yet, for sure.
Well, if nobody's talked to you yet, we should speak after this because I know that Teamcenter was part of the package that you purchased, the on-prem version. We just rolled out a version called Teamcenter X, which is all cloud hosted and managed. So that might be something of interest for you as well. That's really wraps things up. I mean, Alexei, any parting words of wisdom or advice or any other insight you'd like to give us on Nautilus before we sign off here?
We're hiring. We look forward to shameless plug for us is we wish that aspiring entrepreneurs and engineers really go apply for those positions. I think we're doing something that's very cutting edge, and I think not only us, but I think a lot of what's going on in aerospace is very cutting edge right now. And so I encourage all the individuals graduating from colleges. I think there's a lot of opportunity for everyone.
So, what kind of people are you looking for?
We're looking for everybody from stress engineers to structural engineers, airframe engineers. We're a little bit farther along. We like to keep a small team. So we're looking for individuals with a lot of experience and a lot of grit. The first airplane was actually built in the garage in a house in San Jose. My wife still tells stories to this day where she wakes up and there's interns running around everywhere. So we're definitely looking for individuals that have the mentality that, get things done. So.
Well, I assume nowadays you don't even need to be in an office, right? So maybe that's offers some flexibility. But building an aircraft, I'm sure you need to have some localized place to come together, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think, going through industry for over a decade, I think it's almost impossible to build an airplane program without being together.
Yeah. How large is the company today in terms of number of employees?
So we're about 10 today. We're actually growing to about 30 by the end of actually going into Q2 of next year. So we're hiring very quickly.
Wow, that's fantastic. Alex, I want to really thank you very much for joining us today and sharing your perspectives. I think Nautilus is a great example of how startup companies can innovate at all levels of system complexity and kind of proof that you need to get off the ground with the right solutions from the get-go. And there's always challenges and barriers to success, but you can, kind of push through them and drive to success. And from a Siemens perspective, we want the listeners here and our community to know that we're working with companies like Nautilus to help achieve goals. And just as a final statement, thank you very much. And I wish you and your team all of the best and hope you're successful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul.